This is episode 91, and I'm interviewing Michael Manincor of the Yoga Institute, and he's going to be discussing yoga and mental health. This is part of the second anniversary celebration of changing the face of yoga. Let's listen. Hello, and welcome to Change the Face of Yoga, teaching toddlers through golden oldies. I'm very excited to be talking to lots of yoga teachers who will explain their passion for teaching yoga to students with different ages, physical fitness levels, wellness levels, and different goals. They will explain the benefits of yoga for these students and will be including teacher tips and pose modifications. I am Stephanie Cunningham of Yoga Lightness, and I've been teaching over 50s for 10 years. So this area is my passion and the passion of many other yoga teachers that you will be listening to in this series. Thank you so much for listening, and let's get started. This is Changing the Face of Yoga, and we're having a great month. We're celebrating the second anniversary of Changing the Face of Yoga podcast, and I have a series of great guests, and today I have an incredible expert on yoga and mental health. And we're going to be discussing how this has become an important part of yoga and what Michael can tell us about it. Our guest is Dr. Michael Manincor. He has over 30 years of teaching experience in yoga. He's undertaken extensive studies under the personal guidance of renowned teacher TKV Dejakar in Chennai, India. And he established the Yoga Institute in 2000, which is a leading provider of the highest standards of yoga teacher training and yoga therapy training in Australia. Yoga holds degrees in education and psychology and has been a registered psychologist for more than 20 years, and now holds a PhD in health science in the area of yoga and mental health. Also is the founder and director of the Yoga Foundation, a non-for-profit organization that provides yoga-based programs for people who experience disadvantage or hardship. He's also employed as a postdoctoral research fellow in mind body at the NICM Health Research Institute, Western Sydney University, and is currently working in the development of mind body therapies as part of the Western Sydney Integrated Health Center. So welcome, Michael. Your resume is so impressive, and I think you'll have lots of really great things to say about mental health and yoga. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that introduction?
No, that's great, Stephanie, and thanks for having me on. Thank you.
I picked a great guest here. I'm really impressed. I see in talking to people on the podcast and just in general that yoga is taking on more and more interest in what it can do for mental health. Obviously, we have a lot of the trauma courses going on for people that are suffering from trauma. But in the general overall look at, why do you think that yoga has suddenly become an important partner in that area?
I think there's a couple of reasons. One would be that people feel good. You know, they practice yoga, they go to yoga classes, they do their own practice, and they feel good. And they feel good in a way that for many people is perhaps a little surprising for them, because whether they've done exercise or previously or not, there's a certain feeling that you get from doing, some form of exercise, particularly if it's some form of cardiovascular exercise. But the feeling that they get when they do a yoga practice, particularly a physical-based asana practice, it's, for a lot of them, it's kind of very new. And that feeling has, I think, led to a little bit of an inquiry into what's going on here in a wonderful kind of a way that has started to help people realize that yoga is much more than just an alternative or a new age or, some a hippie form of, exercise or activity, that there's a real tangible benefit. So I think people don't actually need to be told or explained that yoga really has a significant impact on mood states, on sense of well-being, on stress levels. I think people are starting to realize that more and more. So just by the sheer increase in the numbers of people who do yoga, you've therefore got an increase in the number of people who become more aware of the mental health benefits of it. And so word gets out. People start talking to others. They start talking to their psychologists, their therapists, their doctors, other healthcare professionals. They say, this yoga is really helping. And then also the health professionals and doctors that are going along to do yoga for themselves, they're starting to just realize that, wow, there's actually something in this more than perhaps, we thought previously, and people are talking about it. And then I think the second reason, of course, is that that's now being backed up by more and more research. So it's no longer just that's the talk on the street. There's a lot more interest from the scientific, the medical community who are actually looking at this in a more robust way. And the evidence is starting to grow substantially. So, that also helps to bring kind of the spotlight onto yoga as a modality, as an intervention for, mental health benefits.
Okay, great. Do you see that the medical community, I know I talk to a lot of people and they feel it's kind of difficult to get an into the medical community, them about yoga and what it can do. But are you seeing that? I know that you're in a little different position because you are actually working in that area, but do you see that as going to be easier in the future, that it'll be accepted more?
Yes, I think it will. It's a slow change though. And there are a number of reasons why it's a slow change, because you're dealing with, kind of a paradigm or an institution, if you like, that, has been established for, a couple of hundred years in the way that mental health issues have been dealt with in our society, through psychiatry, through clinical psychology, more recently through medicine in general. There's a paradigm there that is hard to change. It's well established. It's I was going to say well-funded, but, that's a relative concept because, there are certain aspects of our healthcare system that are, terribly underfunded. But there's a lot of money involved and a lot of money that, it's not easy to shift, not only the perceptions, the paradigm, the understanding. It's not easy to shift when, you're talking about very, very large businesses that are based around an approach that's not willing to embrace something that's perhaps questioning that, giving an alternative approach. So, I think it is going to be a slow change, but I think it's definitely happening.
Okay. So how much training do you think that a yoga teacher, possibly a yoga therapist, needs to feel pretty comfortable with the average public and in the area of mental health?
That's a very, very big question, and it's a topical question at the moment. And I think that, how do I give a kind of a simple, brief answer to that? Look, my simple off-the-cuff answer is a lot more than they're currently getting.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is, we've got a paradigm of training, a set of standards that has emerged largely out of the United States, that has been adopted in countries like Australia and many other parts of the world, that I think has actually created a framework that is problematic. And, there's a bit of history involved in here. I've written about this in my own blog posts and other interviews that I've done. The whole idea that one can become a yoga teacher with a short course, to me, is kind of ridiculous. And I don't mean any offense to those who've done those short courses or, those who provide those short courses, because I know that they're good people and they can often have a wonderful personal experience. However, having a wonderful, possibly even life-changing, transformative experience in doing those shorter courses. And I'm talking about the courses of, 200 hours and sometimes less. Mm-hmm. That's become accepted as the baseline of what one can then, what I describe as the knowledge and skills to be competent and confident to go out and teach yoga and share what yoga has to offer to other people. And I think that's a very, very unfortunate baseline that has become well accepted, because I think it takes a lot more than that. The training courses that we offer here at the Yoga Institute, our basic training is a 500-hour training. I mean, even to talk about numbers and hours, I think is a bit of a problem in itself. So it's nominal, but it's about kind of what level of knowledge and skills does someone have. And many people say that the basic training, let's call it the 200 hours. Of course, in Australia, it's 350 hours, even though many people do 200-hour course. The minimum training required to become a registered yoga teacher in Australia is actually 350. So many people do shorter courses and then they need to do more. Often they want to do more, which is wonderful. Mm-hmm. And that kind of just leads on to further training if you're working with people with injuries and illnesses, and particularly in the area of mental health. So it's worthy of further exploration. I think the yoga teaching profession and what's emerged as the yoga therapy profession needs to really take a look at this and be honest with ourselves and say, although it's big business and people say, look, I can go out, and clearly people are going out and lovely people teaching lovely yoga classes, I think there's a lot more here that needs to be considered. And I'd also say that the distinction that is being made between yoga instructors, yoga teachers, and yoga therapists, they're blurry boundaries, and there's attempts to make clear distinctions, and I don't know that those clear distinctions are altogether valid, even though I understand how it's emerged in the marketplace. So the simple answer is, I think all yoga teachers, if people are going to really embrace what yoga has to offer, understanding the nature of the human condition, then a lot more training is actually required at a base level. If you're going to be working with people with mental health concerns, then, a certain amount of specialist training is needed there. But that if is kind of the key point. That's a lot of people. There's a lot of people going to yoga classes and seeking out yoga teachers who do have mental health concerns. And, it's not just the odd person here and there. It's a lot of us, and I'm happy to be included there. There's a lot more going on here, and I just don't think that we can get away with this anymore by just saying, basic training, short 200-hour courses are enough. I just don't believe they are. And then how can we bring an awareness of mental health into any level of teacher training? Should it be part of basic teacher training, or is it something that people who do basic teacher training then need to do further special interest in it, or then do we go down the path of yoga therapy? I think it's complex.
If you're telling me that there's a significant proportion, and I don't exactly know what that is, but of people that are coming to just a normal, everyday yoga course who have mental health concerns, that's scary. I mean, it's just...
I agree.
Oh, good. I thought it was just me. But I just think...
No, I absolutely agree. It's scary in the sense that it's challenging.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a little concerned about all the trauma courses because I just don't know if you can feel confident after a weekend.
Absolutely. Look, I'm really going to push the point here, and I'm passionate about it. I've been involved in yoga and education and training for a long time, and I've worked a lot through Yoga Australia. Really passionate about this topic. So, pull me up if you think I'm kind of getting a bit worked up about it. But there's a scenario at the moment where there's people around. I think that these are really wonderful, well-intentioned people. From my point of view, there is no question about that. These are good people with good hearts who are trying to do good work, who have very, very basic training, and I'm talking about 200 hours or less, who can now do a 4-hour workshop being provided by another organisation, and then go out as a volunteer working with vulnerable people at some pretty hardcore end of the mental health spectrum. Look, I think that is actually dangerous. It's dangerous for the yoga teachers to put themselves into that situation, unless, of course, they have some other professional background. But of course, that's another whole discussion if they're dual professional. If they've got some background in mental health, they're a mental health nurse or a social worker or a psychologist or a therapist, that's a different discussion. But we're talking about people who don't have that training, that professional background, who are doing really basic training as a yoga teacher, doing a half-day workshop. I'm not referring to the training that's available, the trauma-sensitive yoga that's being taught, those workshops, which is mostly a weekend. I'm talking about training that's being offered now, even less than that. A 4-hour workshop, almost like an induction to join particular non-profit organizations who are providing volunteer yoga teachers to go out and teach in hospitals, in prisons, in refuges, with really, really vulnerable people. I think it's really potentially dangerous, but it certainly is unprofessional.
Yeah. I talked to someone
I think we need to lift our game.
And I didn't put it into your introduction only because I wasn't sure if we'd get there, but you said that you are former president and honorary life member of Yoga Australia, which is the peak body for the yoga teaching profession in Australia. And yet you're very passionate about changing what is a very set in stone kind of education system.
Yeah.
Are they open to this change?
Absolutely. Dare I say, equally passionate as I am. And when we say open to change, what's important to recognize here is that if we're talking in hours here, and hours is kind of like an unfortunate way to be talking about it, because we've got better ways of training people in different professions. There are very, very few professions who work out their training standards based on number of hours. Certainly in Australia, we have a different system here, whether it meets the requirements of, say, a certificate 1 or 2, 3, 4, a diploma level, an advanced diploma. So in Australia, we've got a different way of what we would call vocational training or professional training. But what's emerged is a training system or standards that is based on number of hours. And again, it's what's become well established in the marketplace, and it's unfortunate. So, I think that's a problem to begin with. However, Yoga Australia has had a minimum standard of 1 year training or 350 hours of training over 1 year as their base training. So the challenge is not so much with whether Yoga Australia is embracing what I'm saying, because they've already done that. They've been doing that for many, many years. In fact, originally when the Yoga Australia was formed, it was 320 hours, and then it was increased to 350 hours. The problem here is that in the United States, Yoga Alliance established a standard for yoga instructors of 200 hours, but many, many training providers in Australia and across the world have chosen to accept the American standards rather than the Australian standards. So I don't think there's really a question here about openness and willingness of Yoga Australia to rethink this, because I think they're already, kind of ahead of the game, so to speak, and definitely interested in embracing a reconsideration of what's required, especially then as we move into the area of yoga therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah?
Yeah. Because I agree with you. It's a little blurry.
Yeah, it's very blurry.
and it's difficult to make some distinctions there. But
yeah.
Especially in the area of mental health, I quite frankly, and it's been a while, so it could be my memory, I don't remember actually getting any kind of, it was mostly asanas and, how you do those and how you manage a class and that kind of thing. And I don't remember anything about mental health. I really don't, other than meditation.
No, it is interesting.
Mm-hmm. And that's kind of iffy.
Well, there's a couple of things here. You've got the types of techniques or tools, if you like, of yoga that we can use, and there's the asana, there's pranayama, there's yoga nidras, there's meditation, there's use of sound and chanting, there's mantras, visualization, and the list goes on. These are all tools and techniques that we can use, and all of them have either a direct effect or an indirect effect on the physical body, the functional systems of health, the way energy moves, the way that we experience emotion, and the way the mind works. So it's not quite as simple as saying the asana is for the body and the meditation is for the mind. All of them work on what I would describe as the mind-body continuum. So asana can very much have benefits in the area of mental health, just like any other tool of yoga. It's just more of an indirect effect, but real nonetheless. So back to your point about what's included in teacher training is that the predominance is around the body, and both in terms of the tools of asana, but also around the framework, because we spend a certain amount of time studying yoga anatomy or studying anatomy and physiology from a Western physiological anatomical perspective. And we spend almost zero time in most teacher training courses around psychology. So, we've already put this to Yoga Australia, myself and one of my colleagues and friend, Janet Lowndes from Melbourne, who's also a psychologist, and we work in this space together, is that we would like to see in all teacher training courses, of course, we need foundations in functional anatomy, but we also need foundations in mental health. It ought to be just simply part of basic teacher training. But of course, in a shorter course, there's no room for it.
I'm just wondering if we're going to really take advantage of the absolute all of yoga, will 350 hours do it? Or what does it? What are we doing that for now and in the future when we realize that things like mental health it's really important information to have if you're a yoga teacher?
The obvious answer to that is those who are already yoga teachers who've done basic training and wish to do work in this space need to do more training. And there are various training providers around. How much is kind of another area, depends on the area that you're wanting to work in. As you say, the mental health covers a whole range of things. The most prevalent concerns are in the area of depression and anxiety, people who experience depression or anxiety disorders. Then, of course, there's a whole range of other things, people who've experienced trauma, which may not manifest as a condition of depression or anxiety. It might. There are all sorts of question marks around that. So then there's dementia, then there's eating disorders, and other more severe forms of psychoses, depending on what kind of population that you're working with. So I guess there's two other ways of looking at this. One is, are we teaching general yoga classes and make them welcoming of people who have mental health concerns in a way that is safe and accepting, and even that's being modified for their needs? So there are many approaches to yoga practice that, if someone has got an anxiety condition, it can simply make it worse. And similarly with depression, there are certain techniques that you might use that might be part of classes that take people into a space that's not healthy for them. So that's one scenario. Is this for yoga teachers who are teaching general classes, knowing that it's highly likely that people will come along to those general classes or that particular style of yoga with mental health concerns? Or is that style or that approach to yoga classes suitable for those people at all, and maybe they won't come? The second scenario is where yoga teachers want to teach with specific populations, for specific groups of people who are presenting with mental health concerns. And so that's a little bit different. Some of the knowledge and skills required would be true for both, but then there's also more specialty training if you're going to work more specifically with those groups of people.
Okay, well, if you want to work with specific groups of people, then I can certainly understand additional training. But if you're just offering your yoga classes to the public, what do you need to know as a yoga teacher when people may present with mental health concerns? And I understand that there's a whole variety of them, but is there any basic information that should be in your training that would help you as a yoga teacher be sensitive to these people's needs?
Look, I think that most people would agree that the first and foremostly is that people feel safe. And that's true of everyone who comes along to the class. We don't know a lot about people's backgrounds. We don't know what they've experienced in the past or more recently, what they're going through at the moment. We don't know a lot about that. So I would say that's the next stage. Now, whether this is part of training or not, I think it's fundamental to teaching in general, all teaching, let alone yoga teaching. And that is one of the best ways to be effective as a teacher, is get to know our students. So rather than just instruct a practice, we're teaching people, we're teaching human beings of all ages. And, my background in education and, I guess my philosophy about education is not instructional. It's about engaging in relationship. And as we get to know our students, then we've got a mutually respectful relationship, even if it's in our classes. And of course, this gets extremely difficult when we're teaching classes with large numbers of people in it. If they come regularly enough, over a long enough period of time, we may well get to know them. However, very often we don't, because we're teaching large classes. People drop in and out. Mm-hmm. And it makes it really difficult to then, to answer your question, is to create a safe environment includes getting to know what's safe, what's appropriate in a mutually respectful relationship. And I think that's one of the things that's lacking in a lot of the training, is actually the development of those communication interpersonal skills.
Okay.
Then, of course, I've only half answered your question. Then there's a whole list of many, many more things about, what kinds of things do we need to be aware of. I would hope that people would know, or not be naive enough to make statements like yoga helps, because it doesn't always help. And some things that we could be doing, there would be some techniques that may help one person and may actually have an adverse effect for another person. I'll give you an example of that. we can talk about how working with the breath can be incredibly helpful for people who experience anxiety. Well, for many people who experience anxiety, working with the breath is their worst nightmare. So we're teaching a class. Now, admittedly, most yoga classes have removed much practice to do with the breath and certainly to do with pranayama. So in one sense, if we avoid it altogether, then that's kind of helpful. But then we're missing a very useful, a very powerful tool of what yoga is all about. I would say that it's the central link in what we're working with the body, the nervous system, and the mind. Yoga practice without the breath, Krishnamacharya was famous for saying, yoga without the breath is for dead people. And yet we focus so much on alignment and flow, and we kind of vaguely talk about inhaling and exhaling, but there's so much more going on with the breath that affects the nervous system, that affects emotional states, that brings up memories, that it's a very, very powerful and effective tool, and we need to know how to use it. And most teacher training courses, as you said earlier, don't include an understanding of really working with the breath. And so we just avoid it, which is not the best approach, not the most effective approach.
Yeah.
And then equally with meditation. People often talk about yoga and meditation like as though they were separate practices. Well, they're not. In yoga, we can practice yoga asana, we practice yoga pranayama, we practice yoga meditation, we practice yoga mudra. They're all forms of yoga practice, all components of yoga practice. I know a lot of people listening would be very aware of that. However, we have created a language around yoga and meditation, and it's very commonly used. So if we put the meditation back into the yoga, then it becomes a very useful tool for some people. And how do we know what's useful for some people and not helpful for other people, possibly even detrimental to them at that point in time, is by getting to know our students and taking a much more personalized approach. So rather than kind of a list of things to be aware of, which I think is a great starting point, by the way, it's a great starting point from where we are to give people greater awareness of how to perhaps be safe and perhaps more effective in being inclusive of people who come to yoga classes with mental health concerns. But I think we might need a bit of a re-understanding of a reframing of what yoga teaching is actually all about. And from the background that I come from, it needs to be a much more personalized approach rather than a mass-produced approach. As soon as we go into a mass-produced approach, then we're going to be at risk of bringing benefit to some people and causing harm for others, or they simply won't come. Or they might come, not like it, and never come again. Mm-hmm. I know this is challenging the framework to some extent, and your question, I think, is a very useful and a practical one. What's the next step? What can we do? And I think the next steps is we do need more education and more training, and to rethink how we're actually training yoga teachers.
I've been really educated, shall we say, by this podcast about so many people who are trying so hard to make those relationships because they think important in the yoga, and they do it in lots of different ways. But I just am amazed at how people have come to this saying this is where I should be. And you're right, you have 50 people in a class, you're not going to get to know hardly anybody. And yet I have been in classes like that, not taught them. I don't feel comfortable teaching them, but it was very asana based and it was very impersonal. Now, being a yoga teacher, I knew what I needed to get out of it, and I didn't have any problem with that. But I just wonder how yoga is going to get away from, and I admit that it's probably the US-based method of yoga teaching. How in 10 years can we get away from that? Or can we improve it? Or can we change it?
To change which part in particular? Teaching larger classes, do you mean? Larger impersonal asana-based classes?
No, I think to make yoga safer for everyone and more authentic.
Yeah, well, again, at the risk of sounding repetitive, I think the baseline is more education, more training. So whether you've had basic training already and you are interested in doing further training, or that our basic training, our standards for basic training need to improve. I think that's what I would like to see it looking like in 10 years' time. and how that works, and different approaches, different styles, the way different teachers like to work. Of course, there's no need to be prescriptive about that at all. We'd love to see teachers continuing to work in the way that they work best, rather than being too prescriptive about that. But I think a more solid foundation that gives a much broader understanding of the nature of the human condition, how we work as people, not just our muscles and bones in terms of functional anatomy, but much, much more depth. And of course, we are also talking about the human energetic system as well. So I just don't know any other way to frame it rather than more and better education and training in what yoga does and can offer safely and effectively. So we don't want to just keep it safe. And when we can all stay safe with this by just kind of staying at home and don't do anything. So there's more to it than being simply safe. That's absolutely critical as a foundation. But it's how can we be effective? Because, yoga has so much to offer. And what we've done is we've taken a small part of it and tried to maximize how we use that small part, maximize and popularize, which is great. It's great that people are, going to classes, and I've got nothing against fit, healthy people going along to the energy, the vibe, what you get from going to those, more dynamic classes with lots of people in them. I think it's great. I don't have any concern about that. But they're not the places for the many, many people who, are not fit, strong, young and healthy, or pretending to be, if I can say that.
Yes. Okay, so I guess I agree with what you're saying. In fact, I very much agree with what you're saying. But do you think that it is possible, given the business, the way that the business of yoga training is? It's rather expensive just to take a 200 level, and there's absolutely no guarantee that you'll ever make that back classes. If we go to even more training, it's going to cost even more, which will, two things will happen. One, there'll be less people taking it, and it will cost more for those that do take it.
Yeah.
Is that going to happen?
Look, I don't know. I don't have the crystal ball on it. You've raised a number of delicate points there, but it's a broad, sweeping statement. So I'd like to see it happen. We can see the benefits in other areas, service providers in the area of health. Whether it's perhaps at the furthest extreme would be the time and the cost involved around training someone to become a medical doctor. So, we would not find it at all acceptable if there was a business model around that said, well, we can't, we need to lower the standards to train more doctors and make it more affordable. We'd be horrified by that idea. I know that there are kind of a lot of complexities around that as well. However, we're dealing with the human condition here. This is not just a nice little fitness regime or, something that's kind of fairly innocuous. If we really see the potential of what yoga has to offer human lives, particularly human lives who experience pain, suffering, difficulty, which is most of us at some time, or dare I say all of us at some time, then I think it is appropriate to be considering, are we willing to embrace this? Are we as a yoga teaching profession? I know I sound like a lone voice, and I'm often challenged on this, but there are many people who agree with what I'm saying who would like to see it changed. So your question is, will it change? Can we see it actually changing? And I think it's only going to change in one of two ways, and that is we as a yoga teaching profession embrace that, and we change it ourselves within the various associations, whether it's Yoga Alliance or Yoga Australia or whichever part of the world we happen to be in. Are we willing to embrace that? And is the market willing to accept that? And there might be pushback, and that's okay if there's pushback if we believe in that. The second is that there may be, as has been attempted in various countries, certainly in various states in the United States, and that is we may not have a choice. It may be legislated against us or for us, which is exactly what's happened in other areas which previously didn't require licensing. So I'm not saying licensing here is necessarily a good way to go. I'm saying it's a possibility that we may not have much choice.
Mm-hmm.
either governments, whether it's state or federal governments, will say, if you work with vulnerable people, people who have injuries, particularly people who have mental health concerns, let alone any other form of illness, then you need to be licensed because you're working with vulnerable people and this is what will be involved. So we either embrace that for ourselves or it will be legislated and licensed for us. Now, I don't know if and when that's going to happen, but, it's a fairly likely scenario at some stage. It's happened in massage therapies. It's happened in Chinese medicine. It's happened in acupuncture. It's happened in a whole range of areas. So I think yoga is just on the list for, sooner or later, it's likely to happen. And again, I'm not saying I think that's what should happen. I'm saying it's one of the possibilities, and it would be far better if we as a yoga teaching profession embrace that, rather than saying, oh, it's too hard or it's too expensive or, it's not sustainable from a business point of view. I think there are far too many concerns being raised about the business side of it than about the care of people. And I think that's a real problem.
I think it's easier to raise those objections from the business side because you have some very specific things you can talk about. It's more difficult to talk about we're trying to bring yoga to everyone because it has benefits for everyone. That's a pretty fuzzy statement. And
it really is.
Yeah. And so I think people can fight the business easily, much more easily than they can fight what we're talking about here. I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying I agree with it. I'm just saying I think it's an easier argument to make.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, so...
And like in other areas, there is a lot of money involved in people's livelihoods and, all of that is all part of it too, and that can't be ignored.
No. This has been a fascinating conversation. It went in a total direction, which is why I love podcasts, because you just never quite know how a conversation will turn out. But if there's anything that you would like to talk about that you don't think we covered enough or that we didn't cover at all, I'll give you the opportunity to do that now.
Yep. So look, again, this is my area of interest, and it's a growing area of interest amongst a small number of people. And that is, I think, what also comes to this discussion is not my opinion or your opinion or popular opinion, but what's the evidence? And so I think we need a more robust approach to sorting out some of the various opinions that people have through a much more rigorous approach. And that's part of the world that I'm involved in and will continue to be in the area of research, so that we actually start asking questions that are more evidence-based. And, some of that is just gathering more and more information about, are people actually being harmed? Are there any kind of adverse effects people doing, particularly in the area of mental health? Or are there barriers to access? All of those kinds of things are part of the research questions. And then looking at, I'm saying that, various techniques perhaps could make, someone who's got symptoms of anxiety or depression, that various approaches to yoga practice and yoga techniques could actually make them worse. Well, that's certainly my clinical experience. I've been doing this for a long time, and many would share their anecdotal evidence around that from a practitioner or a teacher's point of view. However, we need more evidence about this. We need to help support some of these claims, some of the, be asking some of these questions with a more robust approach through research. And I think that will help. But again, that involves money, it involves investment, and it involves a lot of time, a lot of dedication to do that kind of research. But I think it's part of it. And, it's great to see that there's almost an exponential growth in the number of studies being done in the area of yoga and yoga therapy. Unfortunately, we're in a profession where the practitioners and the teachers don't really have much of an understanding or read that kind of research that's coming out. I mean, perhaps if you go into, some of the conferences or some of the symposiums that are now available, maybe even some of the podcasts, the documentaries that are being done, you might start to get a bit of an interest in it. But in many of the other professions that we're, particularly in the area of yoga therapy and the allied health professionals that we're aligning ourselves with as a complementary modality, then, looking at the research and the evidence and the development of that, the evolution of that, the information that becomes available is very much a very important aspect of the growth and opportunity of what we have to offer people. And of course, the further to that is, what are the implications in terms of what's described as cost effectiveness. It might turn out that if we do good research and we show that various aspects of yoga practice are suitable for different people with different health and mental health concerns, then it might actually save an enormous amount of money, perhaps millions, if not billions of dollars in healthcare budgets. So that starts to become very attractive.
True. I've seen a lot of research, but I have not seen any evidence or any research actually on really opinions that people hold about yoga. And that includes yoga teachers and students, general public. And I hadn't thought about that, but it's an interesting idea, isn't it? That obviously changing the face of yoga has a niche within a niche, which is the people that are not teaching fitness yoga. So I feel like I don't really understand the ones that do the 50-person classes and all of that. I'm not saying that they're not doing good yoga. I'm just saying I don't interact with them very much. And so I feel like I've only got about a little bit of the picture, but it would be interesting to know what people's opinions are about how helpful yoga is in all kinds of different modalities, shall we say.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. And also to be looking at, like, for example, I'm about to start a new study through the university where I'm working. We're about to start a new study. It'll be a small study. It's a pilot study. And if the results are, justify, then we'll be applying for, large grants to do a much larger clinical trial. But we're going to be comparing the effectiveness of group yoga classes to one-on-one sessions and personal yoga practice for people who present with depression and anxiety. And my hypothesis around that is not that one is better than the other, but one may work better for different people than a different approach. So we've kind of got these two approaches available, whether we call it yoga teaching or yoga therapy, that can be done in a group class, which is where the vast majority of yoga teaching is done. But yoga has a very rich and authentic tradition of working one-on-one with people and developing a suitable personalized home practice, not to be confused with yoga therapy. Yoga therapy can be in either context. And some people might get more benefit by going to a group class, and others, that may not be helpful for them. They may get more benefit by working one-on-one and developing a regular personal practice to be doing at home. So that information is really important, because then we can start to design different approaches for different people in ways that are going to help them the most. So that requires research in order to kind of explore those kinds of questions.
Yeah. No,
and similarly with different styles, different approaches, different dynamics, different techniques, there are a lot of questions that people have very strong views about. Yoga enthusiasts and yoga teachers have very strong views about, because that's their background and their approach and maybe what they love and what's brought benefit in their lives. But we need to be asking broader questions around that. We wouldn't find that approach acceptable in other areas of working with people, particularly vulnerable people.
Okay. Well, I'll look forward to the research. That sounds really fascinating. I hadn't thought about that. But yeah, there is a difference between a group class and a one-on-one. So thank you, Michael. I really want to thank you for this. It's just been interesting, and I appreciate you being passionate about what you think and sharing it with us. Sometimes people don't want to say anything that might offend someone or make someone feel uncomfortable. So I really want to thank you for being honest, and I think it'll be a great podcast. And so thank you.
Stephanie, thank you for your work. And, I really do hope that I don't offend anyone. I know that what people are doing with good hearts and doing, what they think is best. Of course, this is just my opinion and my experience. So, if I do offend anyone, I really do apologize. Certainly not my intent.
Okay. All right.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Bye.
Thanks. Take care.
Thank you for that wonderful interview. If you would like to be a guest on Changing the Face of Yoga, please go to my website, www.yogalightness.com.au, and under the Changing the Face of Yoga tab, you can complete Be Our Guest form. After reviewing the form and finding it applicable to this podcast, we will send you a link to schedule an interview. Please download, review, and tell your friends of any podcast that are of interest to you and to them. If you would like to contact me, send an email to info@yogalightness.com.au. And thank you for listening to Changing the Face of Yoga.